Number 1 Troop of A Squadron, Royal Bedfordshire Yeomanry, have been called forward to assist their infantry counterparts in dealing with an enemy stronghold. They were going in at night, which was not something the tank men liked to do. But then they had little choice. The enemy positions had to be taken by sunup. The force attacking comprised of, as already mentioned, 1 Troop of A Squadron Royal Bedfordshire Yeomanry under the command of Lieutenant Rhys Fraser, leading his troop on his first ever action, but also 4 Platoon of B Company, 1st Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, together with the Scout Platoon of the same battalion. The objective was a small village on the other side of the river that marked the front line. The infantry, supported by the tanks, would have to get into that village, destroy the enemy, cling on to the village and hold it against enemy counterattacks. A lot of enemy activity had emanated from that village, patrols with armoured vehicles as well as foot patrols, and it was generally believed that a platoon of reconnaissance troops may be stationed in the village. Lieutenant Fraser led his troop towards the river, supported by the reconnaissance troops from the Scout Platoon of the 1st Battalion Rifle Brigade. So far, on the advance to contact, the British troops had faced no enemy resistance, as the infantry moved through the wooded areas and the armoured vehicles went along the road. Sergeant Charles Ross, the troop sergeant of 1 Troop, recalls, "It were bloody dark, and I did not like that at all. Tanks don't suit night actions. It could allow enemy infantry to get up close, use explosive charges, or toss grenades down tank hatchways, as we were to find out later in the action." Sergeant Ross was actually a regular soldier. He had joined the regiment before the war, being one of the regiment's few full-time soldiers. Most of the regiment comprised of TA soldiers, part-timers, who had subsequently been mobilised for the war. Now, as the British forces attempted to cross the small river, the enemy began to show itself. Enemy infantry, supported by armoured cars and mortars, began to fire into the British ranks. But it was actually a field gun firing over open sights that caused the first casualties among the British soldiers, exploding amongst one of the infantry sections as they prepared to cross the river. The Scout Platoon commander now called back to the battalion's mortar platoon, calling in a 3-inch mortar barrage in the centre of the village. And on the right flank, Lieutenant Fraser's tank, at the head of his troop, knocked out an enemy armoured car. The 3-inch mortar barrage had for now suppressed the enemy, and the infantrymen of 4 Platoon now prepared to cross the river. They did so under the cover of the 3-inch mortar that they had brought with them from the mortar platoon, to provide some more close-in support. Lieutenant Fraser remembers, "Those chaps with the mortar didn't let up once. They constantly fired, round after round after round. Fortunately for them, we had brought with us one of our regimental echelon trucks towing a trailer, and into this we stuffed all variety of ammunition and supplies, including mortar bombs. Otherwise that 3-inch mortar would have almost certainly have run out." Number 1 Troop, following a Daimler armoured car, had gotten across the river at last, and was now on the outskirts of the village. Here, they changed from line astern to line abreast, allowing the 3 tanks of the troop to provide mutual support and cover a large frontage. Coming up behind them was tank call sign George 1-2. This was one of A Squadron headquarters tanks, a close support tank. Rather than having the 2-pounder gun, it fired a 3-inch howitzer, allowing it to fire high explosive rounds, as opposed to the 2-pounder armour-piercing slugs, to which the other cruiser tanks were restricted to. Corporal Lawrence Robinson, the commander of tank callsign Bravo 1-3, had been made aware that there were enemy armoured vehicles pushing through the village towards the infantry, and so he'd ordered his tank forwards and out to the right, where his crew can get shots up the main road of the village, right to the flank of a Panzer I tank, giving him his first tank kill of the war.
1-3 to 1-1, we've knocked out a Panzer I, there are more armoured vehicles in the village. Not seen any sign of any anti-tank guns as of yet. Over.
The position of 1-3 under Corporal Robinson put the enemy defenders in a perilous position. They began to pull back, but not before losing yet another armoured car to the gun of Corporal Robinson's tank. Corporal Lewis, commanding George 1-2, was also stalking an enemy armoured car, and the enemy couldn't have known that George 1-2 was there, as Corporal Lewis ordered his gunner to fire through a hole in the building behind which the armoured car was hiding. The shell landed plumb on, sending the armoured car bucketing up into the air, spinning its crew all over the road. The work of No. 1 Troop had allowed for 4 platoon as well as the scout platoon to start pushing forwards and prepare to move into the village. However, Corporal Lewis became aware of enemy infantry hiding behind a nearby wall and ordered his gunner to machine gun them. However, his gunner stepped on the wrong trigger button, firing off a 3-inch shell straight into the enemy position, blowing it apart as well as the infantryman. Sergeant Ross had observed this and remembers. "It seemed quite shocking really, firing the main gun at such close range. I actually called up Corporal Lewis on the net and said, 'Bloody hell Lou, that was a bit drastic.' There was a short pause until at last he replied, 'Aye, never mind. It's my understanding that his gunner stepped on the main gun button rather than the coax machine gun button.' Such things occurred in the heat of battle after all. At last the men had a firm foothold within the village, and now it was simply a case of flushing out the rest of the defenders and sending them packing. However, the main concentration of enemy soldiers to the north were well dug in and had heavier weapon support, anti-tank weapons as well as anti-aircraft weapons that could be used in the ground support role, and potentially even penetrate the armour of the British tanks. George 1-2, with members of 4 platoon, were tasked with pushing left towards the west to loop round and to hopefully catch the enemy in the flank. And so George 1-2 pushed on. However, the tank did outrun its infantry pretty quickly. The infantrymen had not yet begun to move when George 1-2 began engaging enemy positions towards the north. This lack of immediate infantry support, as well as the crew of George 1-2 becoming fixated on the targets to their front, was welcoming danger. And though Corporal Lewis positioned the tank in such a way that he was able to fire off a shot right at an enemy gun, knocking out its crew with a high explosive round, but enemy infantry had been able to approach the tank in the darkness, throw a large explosive charge which knocked out the tank entirely, and only Corporal Lewis and his gunner immediately survived and were able to bail out. However, Corporal Lewis was immediately shot down by the fast approaching enemy infantry, and his gunner, Alexander Brown, ran for his life, running through enemy infantry positions. He was seen to be hit multiple times before at last being shot down and succumbing to his wounds. Despite the loss, the British troops kept pushing forwards. The infantrymen clawed their way from building to building, whilst the tanks worked around the flanks of the village, engaging enemy positions and armoured vehicles. Without the 3-inch howitzer of George 1-2, knocking out enemy emplacements was of course harder, but the other cruiser tanks used their machine guns and their 2-pounder armoured piercing rounds to engage enemy gun emplacements and mortars. Lieutenant Fraser had moved his own tank up into the middle of the village, where he could engage enemy infantry with his machine gun. Enemy infantry that had attempted a very local and small counterattack against 4 platoon in the left flank. Sergeant Ross's tank, Alpha 1-2, turned to engage enemy Panzer 1 moving in from the north. A single shot brought the Panzer to a halt, and a second shot sealed its fate as the crew began to abandon their little tank. Having been fully aware of how the crew of George 1-2 had been gunned down as they abandoned their vehicle, Sergeant Ross was not in a forgiving mood, and he machine gunned the surviving crew members as they abandoned their tank. Now, over on the left flank, the scout troop vehicles were coming under heavy attack from enemy heavy weapons, 20mm guns as well as machine guns. The enemy were trying to bring these weapons into the village, where they could be lost amongst the buildings, and be used to engage tanks at very close range. But fortunately, Scout Platoon with their brain carriers had kept them at bay. It was now, however, that disaster very nearly struck. The village had effectively been captured, but an enemy field gun now opened fire on Corporal Robinson's tank, which had already been slightly damaged by an enemy gun earlier. We'd been pushing up through the village when we were struck on the side by a glancing blow by a large shell. We saw the gun and began engaging it with our machine gun and our 2-pounder, but their next shot struck us a nasty blow. Only I and my driver were able to escape from the tank as it rolled to a stop. The rest of the crew were killed immediately. The gun was in turn engaged by Lieutenant Fraser, whose tank destroyed it with a hit from his 2-pounder gun. And with that, the battle effectively came to an end. The British had suffered 17 casualties in their attack, including the entire crew of the cruiser CS tank. The infantrymen had also suffered some casualties too, and of course, the losses to Corporal Robinson's tank right at the end of the battle. But the village had been captured, and an estimated 208 enemy soldiers had been killed or badly wounded, many of them taken prisoner. For one of the Royal Bedfordshire Yeomanry's first actions of the war, they had not done badly at all.